Hey guys, well welcome back to the Ether Hub. My name's Simon, bringing you another Magic the Gathering discussion video. Now, there's been a topic that's been bugging me for a while, and I know it's been bugging a lot of people in the Fourth Coast community. I've seen a lot of threads, people talking about it, and that all comes down to what is the reason for the declining quality, it feels like, in the story for Magic the Gathering. So today I'm going to go over what has changed in MTG in terms of how set blocks are broken down and try to answer some key questions relating to them. How MTG delivers their sets and blocks has changed a lot over the years, and I believe this is a key reason to the decline of the overall MTG storytelling. Now, it's not the only reason, and I'm not trying to make the argument that it's the sole reason for its decline, but I will be exploring how it could be an impact and some changes that we could make to make it better. So guys, remember, all of this is just simply my own opinion coming from someone who's covered the game for 7 years, and I'm just a big old fanboy for the story overall. So take that with a grain of salt, and make sure you provide your own opinions in the comment section below. So we're going to go over how the one set block structure could have ruined the MTG story. Are they good for card balance, and what we can do to fix the issues. And don't forget to share your own thoughts in the comment section below, like and subscribe if you enjoy, and now let's get into the video. So, real quick rundown on the history of blocks and how they're structured in Magic the Gathering. For a long time, blocks were pretty much broken out into 3 sets that released the same frequency as the sets do today. There would be 2 main sets and then typically a smaller set sandwiched right in the middle to fill out the block. The whole idea of the 3 sets to contain a block dynamic and structure had 2 pretty major consequences. It meant that we were on the same plane for the vast majority of a standard format, and honestly, IRL time, we were there for a really long time. And that was all before we could move on to a different plane. We had to settle out that the 3 sets for that block. This resulted in a lot of burnout and sameness for players. Being on the same environment, being in the same aesthetic for that amount of time really caused some burnout in the player base. And the middle set of the block was typically always a small set. It contained a lot fewer cards. It had weaker power. There was a lot of downsides to having this 3-set formula. Mostly of which the second set of the block and the third set of the block were all kinda not great. The first introductory set that introduced the plane and the world and the cards and the mechanics and the aesthetic was always much bigger. It had its good foot stepped forward, and it was really most likely beloved by the groups or by player bases. And then as it went on, less and less encouraging things happened in these sets. Cards were weaker, card pool was less, and not to mention in drafting and limited, you had to draft across these different sets from the same block in order to compete in a limited environment. And that could be difficult as these different sets brought in different mechanics. Sometimes these mechanics worked fine together, other times they didn't. They meshed very poorly, and it created a very lackluster limited environment. So with the result of the 3 sets per block kind of dynamic, a lot of players basically hated the small middle sets and didn't really buy much of it, as players just didn't like drafting in a limited environment across multiple sets with different mechanics. On the flip side, Wizards didn't like stretching a world's theme across 3 different sets, but they also had to try and somehow make them all feel different enough for players to be interested in. So what you got from this was that they had a block with 3 sets. They would all at some point be involved in the limited environment in them. They had to adhere to the theme of the world and the theme of the ongoing story arc in that world. But they also had to make each set different enough to be interesting to players to want to buy. You can't just have 3 separate sets with the same mechanics. They could be different cards, but if they share the same mechanics, it's not going to be interesting enough for people to just pick them up unless there was just like an insane power boost between the sets. And then they would feel bad about the previous sets. So you would always be stuck with these weaker middle sets that people didn't really have much interest in, and that was kind of like the driving force to ending the 3-set block system. The 3-set block structure was stopped back in 2014 with Magic Origins, which saw the end of the 3-block system along with core sets jammed in there as well. To core sets being discontinued and the 2 sets now making a block, that became the new norm for Magic the Gathering. With no more core set, they went to 2 separate sets to form a block. This was similar to a previous set, Lorwyn and Shadowmoor back in the day, and they wanted to re-explore that kind of dynamic. So this was the first time, starting with Magic Origins, they changed the entire dynamic. They cut out and do away with core sets, which never really provided much story anyway, and went to 2 fairly big sets per block, cutting it down an entire set. Basically, they axed that middle set that no one really liked. So that's kind of like the history of blocks in Magic the Gathering and how we kind of got to the 2-set block. But once again, that paradigm kind of proved a little bit problematic. Despite the Ixalan block being, in my opinion, really enjoyable for a player like me anyway, the absence of a core set for crucial reprints and the continuation of a big set versus a smaller set dynamic meant that 2-set block system was soon to be ended as well, with the before mentioned Ixalan block. That was the final block to use this experimental 2-set per block system. So with the 2-set block structure being axed with Ixalan, we reached the final and most current structure that we have today, the so-called 3-in-1 model, which saw the return of core sets in MTG. The name comes from the 3 individual sets being released per season, with a core set filling in that summer slot. So the very first set to kind of adopt this single large set that it makes its own block was Dominaria. And honestly, it was pretty successful in my opinion. It was a great way to start off this new formula. Presented a story, it had a good draft environment in my opinion, but it really started to pick up steam with the entire War of the Spark, story cycle. And it really eats into another point that we're going to bring up later in this video about how the story can be connected over the course of these individual blocks that all share a similar theme, plane, and story. Still, there were a lot of positives to the single set block that served to alleviate some of the problems in the previous structures. In this model, we see even larger pools of cards per set to make up for the missing cards lost with subsequent smaller sets to fill up an entire block. Now, that doesn't mean that it's inherently without its own issues. We have the core set providing those crucial reprints. We have a large number of cards contained within these sets to provide players with a lot of options, a lot of new things to get interested in about a set to buy into it. But again, it's not without its issues. So let's go and answer the question, how does it ruin the story of MTG, or at least the storytelling found in Magic the Gathering? So while we could say that the single set block was doomed from the start, I actually don't think it was. With Dominaria introducing a world that players were very familiar with and characters that we all understood the history of, it was a great jumping off point to sell this new structure. But it actually kind of hid the inherent problems that came with it. We returned to a plane that we knew a lot about. We had a lot of characters that we knew the history of. The set and the story in it really didn't have to rehash that stuff for a lot of the player base. And people who were interested in those characters would just simply go online and find their own research. But the set itself and its own self-contained story didn't have to go back and introduce all that stuff. It wasn't like it was introducing a new plane and new characters. This was a problem that came up later on with this structure, something that we're just now starting to see really impact the story of MTG. But it was pretty conveniently and well hidden with the guise of Dominaria and all of its familiarity. So the main reason I have for disliking these single set blocks is its impact on the story contained within those blocks. For its initial use during the War of the Spark, after Dominaria, during the War of the Spark arc, this change really didn't have a huge impact. Even though the sets were their own standalone blocks, they all connected the world of Ravnica and the story taking place there. It made cohesive sense and was basically just a stretched out version of the traditional 3-block structure. But because the way the story was released to us, it did feel like it dragged on quite a bit. All of this was in an attempt to hype up the big War of the Spark novel that came at the very end. So while it wasn't the best story in the world and at the best pace, you can see how a great story could have been told through this sort of system. So how does a single set block ruin MTG's story, in my opinion? Well, it comes down to what we're currently seeing, the jump from world to world within a year that sees no logical connection between them. Yeah, I know there can be a logical link between the stories happening here, and it could be like an Avengers moment where we're building up small independent storylines that will eventually all collide, and all that stuff is completely fine. But what I'm talking about is the stories contained in those worlds, and the characters on those worlds right now really don't have any seeming jump to one another. I'm not trying to say that it has to be some big brain, person in the shadow making all these events take place and then we're all going to be connected in the future. I don't think you need to go that big brain with it all the time. Sometimes you can just have a fun romp on a story that's self-contained and it doesn't connect to the greater multiverse at all. That's completely fine. The problem here is that the stories in the worlds are so vastly different that players can't seem to care about them for as long as they're relevant. We can't really get invested in a world unless we explore it. We can't get invested in a story unless it's somewhat meaningful. And while these stories could eventually result in some kind of development in the main characters there, Nissa in, Zendikar Rising, Liliana Vess in Strixhaven, it seems so outside the sphere of influencing the overall storyline of Magic the Gathering right now that a lot of players just don't feel like being invested in it. They don't feel like there's any point to be. Back in the 3 and even the 2 set blocks, we had a logical continuation of a story taking place on a world. Amonkhet, the presentation of a new world, developing its society, presenting its people, its ideologies, its gods, then followed up directly with Hour of Devastation, bringing all the plot home and changing that world forever. We saw a natural progression of that playing over the course of those 2 sets, and the 2 sets also succeeded in bringing 2 completely different feels to the game. Aesthetically, it was one of the 2 set blocks that really felt like it was getting the system correct. Let's take another example. Introduction to Khans of Tarkir. And then we went and we did the whole time traveling aspect, and then we followed all that up with the conclusion, the actions that explained Dragons of Tarkir and how we got there and how everything was flipped. While the mechanics and card quality were hard to account for, there was a clear story benefit to this type of structure. So at the end of the day, time is the issue. Time and availability are crucial when MTG is trying to tell a story through a set or block. And simply put, the more time we spend on a plane, the more lore that can be presented to the player base. This is why so many of us really understand what makes Innistrad or Ravnica or even Tarkir such interesting worlds. It's why we identify so strongly with those planes and have so much nostalgia tied to them. It's why we always look forward to returning to those worlds. We spend a lot of time building those worlds, fleshing out characters. And it wasn't just a quick one-shot like we're seeing with worlds like Kaldheim or Strixhaven today. What we've seen recently with Throne of Eldraine, Kaldheim, Strixhaven, etc. are hyper-condensed stories trying to build a plane, set a scene, introduce characters, and develop others in such a short span of time. We never get to explore the multiple realms of Kaldheim, for example, because we were moved right off to Strixhaven. We aren't able to explore the rich history of Arcavios because there's no more to play with regarding that story. We cannot put all the history of a place contained on the cards of a single set, no matter how big those sets may be. So the story, more specifically, the world building begins to suffer in Magic the Gathering. To me, the sets so far have presented a fine, self-contained story, right? Zendikar Rising, Kaldheim, Eldraine, Dominaria. They all had fine enough stories that followed their characters through a plot, right? That's a story. Though the plot and writing quality are questionable, which impacts the story in a completely different way, and pretty valid way, I gotta say, I can't say that the story was greatly impacted by it being contained in a single set. The issue is that the worlds that they tried to present aren't well fleshed out. We didn't get a good grasp of Zendikar, healing from the Eldrazi, free for the very first time in forever, because the cards needed to focus on the story happening in that set. Eldraine had the support of a novel, but that really isn't happening moving forward. We're not really going to see the support of novels moving forward by Wizards of the Coast. And Kaldheim, to me, is the greatest disappointment of all. A world so vast, with so many different realms to explore, limiting its cards to just those the main characters visited. That's a tragic loss for the lore. There's so many issues that I have with this one set block structure in regards to this lore impact, and that's really where I think most of the damage comes to. Most of the damage in the lore of MTG with the one set block structure hits directly on the world building itself. We can't build a world that we actually care about and want to return to with the cards given to us in a single set. Yeah, we can have a lot of cards in that set, but you're not going to find a good balance between representing the story and the world and building a history contained within those cards. You're just not going to be able to. But you know what? There's another issue with the structures of blocks that have been noted by a lot of players, and that's card balance. Now, the issue of card balance is a real tricky one, and I'm not really an expert on this topic, so please take this with a grain of salt. But because the 3-set block structure had the issue of small blocks being weaker and overall the power of those sets being pretty inconsistent, in general, they were lower. People didn't like drafting the small sets because, well, they were weaker. It made sense from a fun standpoint to improve upon this, but I feel like the one set model has swung things in the complete opposite direction. Bans for standard and other formats have been happening with much more frequency ever since the change to this one set block structure, and that's all because of these bigger sets containing a lot in their own block. They're really pushing out power creep now to a level that before hasn't really been a problem to this degree. This could be in an effort to expand sales, or more and more powerful cards are being printed, or in the same vein, they could be a way to placate to the more casual commander crowd, who are probably some of the most reliable bucks Wizards of the Coast could count on. But either way, power is really starting to explode right now in the game. Now, I'm not knowledgeable enough to comment on this and its effect on the game's overall health. I don't know if it's better to get more money into the game and get people buying by printing strong cards, all at the same time at the cost of banning a few of them every format change. I'm not sure if that's a good trade-off or not. But what's undeniable is that we're swung so much more in the power-hungry environment now with these single-set blocks. And as a result, they just know that, we'll just turn around and ban it in standard. But that builds up a lot of trust issues with the player base. Just banning cards consistently in standard makes people question, do I buy this single? Do I go out and buy this, a lot of packs of this set and search for this one golden card that I can build a deck around or that can help me in my standard play? Because people don't know if it's going to turn around and get banned or not. If a card looks too good to be true, it oftentimes will get banned. And that could just be a way for them to push sales on commander players who don't really get affected by those bans and still want the cards. But it really, irks a lot of people in standard, and honestly, me in limited too. If I get a card like that in limited, I'm going to protect it and maybe I'll sell it back for another draft. Who knows? But all of that kind of goes away when they ban it, and it really adds to a lot of trust issues the player base has with Wizards of the Coast right now. Now, that being said, the switch to a single set block structure is actually a positive change for Limited, the format that I most like to play. While the multiple set blocks brought in a lot of variety with different cards, drafting between them was very wonky as some mechanics didn't mesh well at all together. It felt almost like a chaos draft at times, despite all the developers doing their best effort to make things flow together. So drafting a single set is actually a great idea for this format of the game. So in that, it's a very positive shift. You contain everything into a single set, all the mechanics work well together, all the synergies are there, and you don't have to kind of expand across multiple different designs and ideas and mechanics to make a draft work. So in that sense, a really positive shift for Limited. So ultimately, how do you fix this? What's the solution? And of course, I'm not going to have the sole solution. I'm just going to have my opinion on how I believe they could fix all these issues. So if Wizards of the Coast came to me, how would I suggest to fixing my main issues with these block models? Well, simply put, I would say return to the start of the single set block format and replicate what War of the Spark brought. War's story was dreadful because of its failed novel, but its heart and its foundation was in the right place. Take a world like Coldheim, for example. Span its story evenly across 2 sets to form its block. For more expansive worlds or stories, you can even make an arc that lasts a full year containing 3 or even 4 sets. But each of these sets would have their own self-contained story that all connected to the overall story of that block, with cliffhangers between sets making us excited for what was to come. Don't do what War of the Spark did and superload the story either at the front or the end of the block. Pace it out so we have the contained development of the story over time. It keeps people engaged, it keeps people interesting, it keeps people wanting to come back for more. At least that's from a story perspective. Of course, all of these sets will have their own mechanics and their own feel, but they'll keep the overall theme of that plane that we're visiting and the story contained therein. So it's your perfect balance of making sure that the mechanics and cards are different enough to interest some of the more just mechanically driven players, while also delivering a story and building upon a world over the course of time that keep people who understand the story and like it engaged and wanting to know what happens next. I feel like this would allow a world to be built and expanded upon over time, maybe even allowing us to come back and get that feeling of nostalgia and favoritism players have with particular planes that can only come with us spending time in them. We need to slow down the story and inject more story into it. This can be done realistically with multiple sets contained within a single block story. This is really how I'd like to see it go. So I'm saying right now that if you can artificially lengthen the amount of time that we spend on a plane while still adhering to the things that the benefits, the card and mechanical benefits of having single set blocks, that's the way to go. To follow the War of the Spark arc with the 2 Ravnica sets beforehand, where they were all independent sets, following their own themes and their own mechanics, but still relating back to the story and overall world development of Ravnica. That's where I would like to see the future of Magic the Gathering storyline. So let's go ahead and just have my final thoughts on this topic. Wizards of the Coast know that these issues exist, and at some level understand that at least some of us want to feel a connection with a world before it's just ripped out from under us, right? They even look to return to this formula soon with the next Innistrad block, bringing us 2 single sets that will bridge a story between them. Hopefully this is received well, and maybe, just maybe, they'll expand upon this moving forward, and I really hope they do, because this is the direction I hope they go in. What we can see with Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Innistrad Crimson Vow. With those 2 sets, we're going to return to what arguably the War of the Spark arc started, which was these individual self-contained set blocks that connect with each other over the course of a couple seasons. So if people like that, we can kind of return to that and revisit that, but it's something that I wish Coldheim, and it's something that I wish Strixhaven had before they were, left to the dustbin of history almost. We're all hyper-focused on what's new and what's coming up, that we have no time to sit and digest what we just consumed. We spend so much time thinking about, oh my god, Coldheim, the cool Viking lore. They have gods there. Oh my god, the Phyrexians could be there. Vorinclex is there. Kaya, a ghost assassin, is turning straight up Viking and metal and all this kind of stuff. We were so hyper-focused on that. And we spent almost no time exploring that world once it finally came. All the hype was front-loaded. On that set. The same thing came with Strixhaven. As soon as Strixhaven started releasing spoilers, much earlier than anyone could really anticipate. Leaks help too. Well, leaks are bad, but leaks help in getting the set out earlier. Our attention is immediately diverted from call time and wanting to learn more about that set, and we immediately pivot to Strixhaven. Same thing's gonna happen with Strixhaven. We're done with the story there. There's 5 articles, 5 tiny articles that explain the story of Strixhaven, but nothing else. It doesn't really go into the world of Strixhaven. People don't even know Arcavios is the Strixhaven plane, People think the plane is just called Strixhaven because no one really cared about the lore of the world itself. The world building didn't exist to the point that the plane, most people don't even know is called Arcavios. And this is a rant, and I'm ranting now, guys. This is Rant City. Simon has started rant mode. So the second we need to pull back, spend more time developing a world before just immediately thinking about what's next. And I know, I'm guilty of this, guys. I'm guilty of pivoting from one story to the next because there's constantly more new news coming out all the time. There's constantly new spoilers for a new set, a new side set, a new supplemental set, new commander set, a new anthology theories, a new secret layers. Everything is just so new. It's overwhelming to the system. We don't have time to build up a relationship with a plane. We don't have time to build up relationship with a character or a storyline. And that's not to say that they didn't try, but the fact that they're only allotting 5 small articles per set, per block story is insanity. It is. The writing suffers. The world building suffers. The story translation from cards to actual story suffers. All of this suffers because we spend too little time on a new world and we don't have that time to introduce and develop that world. Now, this has 2 solutions. It really does. You could just artificially increase the amount of time you're on a plane by expanding the numbers of blocks associated with that plane. So, Coldheim set 1, set block 1, season later, Coldheim 2, The Reckoning, whatever. Continuation of the story. You could do that, or you can actually dedicate time and effort in building those stories before the set comes out, and then expanding upon them for the entirety of its life cycle. We get those 5 articles 5 weeks after a set's released. And even less than that, because the stories start to come out before the official set is released most of the time. So let's say we have 3 to 4 weeks of current story coming out when a set is released, or, is hitting the shelves for the first time. After that time, no more effort is put into building that world or its story. This main story is concluded. No one cares. A couple of articles will come out about, here's the bare bones basics of the world. Those articles exist. They do not get promoted very well, and a lot of people don't know they exist. But there are Planeswalker guides for each world, and it gives the bare bones explanation of little fun facts about the plane. It does its best to deliver a world building experience, but it's nowhere near as robust as explaining it through the written medium in an actual story setting. So, you either dedicate more time to the story and the world building and actually put effort into putting out the product that people want, or you expand upon this War of the Spark precedent where multiple single set blocks can come together to tell a cohesive story. These are the 2 things I would explore. Again, I have to reiterate, the single set blocks aren't killing the MTG story as much as I may have thought once I started really thinking about it. In reality, the issue is the amount of time spent on the story. If these single set blocks had more than 5 short articles written about them, yeah, the story would be longer and we wouldn't need more sets dedicated to the same story, obviously. Also, if they spent enough time building out a world and dedicating cards to translate that in-game, maybe I wouldn't have so much to complain about in that arena either. To get players to connect with a new plane in particular, you need to increase the amount a player interacts with that world, namely through the cards in the game itself. You cannot realistically build a world through the cards while also telling a story on those same cards with just a single set, unless it's like bonkers big. This is more easily done over the course of a few sets, and for me, it's the most realistic way to get that feeling back into Magic. I believe keeping a single big set per season structure is good for the health of the game. Just try to keep that power creep under wraps a little bit, guys. However, for the story and the world building of new planes, it would be better to stretch the theme across multiple sets a year. And individual blocks with their own mechanics, but with a shared world and story that helps keep a good level of fantasy and brings it over the course of time to us fans. It gives us the chance to really build up a connection with these worlds, and honestly, that would be my dream for Magic the Gathering moving forward. Anyway, those are just my thoughts on the single set block model we currently have in MTG, with how we got here, its impact, and how I think we can get to a better place. Let me know your own thoughts in the comment section below. Remember to like, subscribe, and tick that notification bell in order to support the channel if you enjoyed the video. Anyway, guys, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, see ya!